Hi, I'm Sam LaBelle, author of American Icons, and you're listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. I'm Tom Guild. Today we'll go to Chicago and New York, talking with Ward Miller of Preservation Chicago, design critic and New York Magazine writer Justin Davidson, and musical guest Eddie Mugavero of the beloved Nashville swing band Bada Bing Bada Boom. And now your host, who's never been to Nashville, Mr. Modernism, George Smart.
Hey, thanks, Tom. It is true. I've never been to Nashville. And until this week, it was not on my architectural radar at all. It's a vibrant city, and over the last 20 years, it has exploded in popularity and growth. Development is everywhere. People are moving there by the thousands, especially from California and New York. Nashville has always been famous for country music, but for modernism, not so much. There's the Martin House, designed by Frank Lloyd Wright student Robert Draper, the Regions Bank Dome, designed by John Preston, and some new houses that evoke mid-century vibes by Ryan Thews. An hour of searching the internet for Nashville modernism only revealed a few houses and a few banks. So I decided to research the architect of the current Grand Ole Opry building, which I was sure was a Greco-Roman edifice or an old brick church conversion.
Yeah, right.
It turns out the previous longtime home for the Opry was the Ryman Auditorium. Sure enough, an early 20th century brick church conversion that is still hallowed ground for musicians. In the 1970s, the new Opry building was built downtown between Briley Parkway and the Cumberland River, and it turns out by a modernist architect, Welton Beckett.
Wow.
His buildings include the Capitol Records Building in L.A., Ford and GE pavilions of the 1964 World's Fair, Disney's Contemporary Resort in Orlando, and he was part of the design team for the famous theme building at LAX. Now there's a reason to get on a plane. Like Jeff Foxworthy's "You Might Be a Redneck" jokes, you might be a modernist if you plan your vacations around buildings, like me. You might be a modernist if the most valuable thing in your living room is an original Barcelona chair. You might be a modernist if you see an amazing concrete building and stop the car to take a photo, much to the groans and disdains of your family. And you just might be a modernist if you start a podcast about modernism. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by June Goldfinger and Jeff Taylor, sponsors of Circle, Square, Triangle, a traveling exhibition on the architecture of Myron Goldfinger, and by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs.
As a fourth-generation Chicagoan, Ward Miller is a lifelong advocate for the city's architectural heritage. For the past 11 years, he served as the executive director of Preservation Chicago, the city's preservation powerhouse. They rally support to protect historical landmarks, publish newsletters, and make annual lists of endangered buildings. Before leading Preservation Chicago, Ward directed the Richard Nickel Committee, helping preserve the archives of the legendary photographer and co-authoring the complete architecture of Adler and Sullivan. If you've seen Ward in action, whether at government hearings, neighborhood meetings, or at any other public event, you know he's a tireless advocate for keeping Chicago's history alive. Here's George's conversation with Ward Miller.
Ward, I want to start off by having you talk about somebody that I think most people have never heard of, but was very important to Chicago, and that man is Richard Nickel. Who was Richard Nickel?
Richard Nickel. Yes, Richard Nickel was an architectural photographer. He studied at the Illinois Institute of Technology and the Institute of Design program, and was very well noted for his beautiful photographs. He developed that skill under Professor Aaron Siskind, who also taught at IIT, and Siskind was known for his photography already, and Aaron Siskind taught there for a number of years, and Richard Nickel really befriended him. And what started off as a graduate thesis project continued on to a publication that we finished about 50 years after Nichols' tragic death in the Chicago Stock Exchange building by Adler and Sullivan as it was being demolished in 1970.
Yeah, the building fell on him or something, I read.
He was in the building. He was just sort of completing the salvage of the Stock Exchange trading room with John Vinci. He went back into the building to Samuelson, and they were basically wetting down the building as they were demolishing it to keep the dust down. As they collapsed the building in on itself and watered it down, there were a number of floors previously that collapsed, and they found Nichol there almost a month later, unfortunately.
But you have really helped keep his memory alive and his accomplishments, and looking at the buildings of Adler and Sullivan and having his archives at the Art Institute now.
That's correct. Yes, that was one of our proud moments. I had wanted to see that book come out since I was about 12, 13, 14 years old, and never really could find out much about it. I just knew that there was something called the Richard Nichol Committee, and you'd see that published, but there was no way to really find an address. It's not like today where you could just go on the internet and search for a person or place. It was a little more intensive, and you'd see little articles every now and then that would say the book is close to being done and will be finished shortly. And when I went to work for John Vinci after studying under him at IIT, where there was a program laid out by Mies van der Rohe, the Department of Architecture, I realized John Vinci had a great amount of Nichols' work and collection in the Vinci office, and also in his home, in his English basement, if you will. And after 20 years of working in his firm, during the first economic crisis, which nobody remembers, from 2003, John asked me if I'd come and work on the book with him. He said I was pretty industrious and I could work on a shoestring. And he knew that this collection interested me because whenever we had scholars coming to Chicago to visit the collection, I arranged to meet them at lunchtime and go through the Nichol archive. So I had a pretty good handle on a lot of the buildings firsthand through the archive. And of course, people like Tim Samuelson and John Vinci and David Norris and even Robert Furhoff were great in supporting our mission. So I set about with John over a course of 7 years to finish the Adler and Sullivan book. In the 1950s, it was supposed to originally maybe be out in 1959. Well, I was born in the 1960s, so this predated me, but grateful to have worked with John and compiled all the information into an 8.5-pound book, 472 pages, a catalog raisonné of their work, and some really, really beautiful portfolio-type pictures from the early years to the Romanesque, to the tall building artistically considered, to the work of Adler and Louis Sullivan alone. To be able to have the portfolio of photographs was really interesting because a great number of these, upwards of 90%, have been lost over time. So it's so important to catch as many buildings as we could. And John would oftentimes say to me, "Ward, you found another muddy historical photograph. We're going to muddy up this book with these muddy photographs." And after finding the 815th photograph, he said to me, "Ward, if you find one more damn historic photograph, you're fired." So we ended it on 815 images. One of the great honors of my life was to help give that collection to the Art Institute of Chicago. I'm told it's in the Ryerson Burnham libraries, and that gives it the most access, and it can dovetail in the photographs with our essays, with the book, with Richard Nichols' library of materials, puts it all in one place. And we're told it's one of their most requested collections. And to this day, every time I find something tied to the Adler and Sullivan firm, I donate it to the Art Institute of Chicago.
You've been working with Preservation Chicago since 2013, which is a fantastic organization. I recently got from Ward an email, which was 240 pages of accomplishments. And I was going through it and discovered, like, These were like real accomplishments. They weren't just BS accomplishments. So you guys really are super busy all the time.
We are, George. Thank you so much. Yes, our service area is just the city of Chicago, which is and hopefully is still known as America's city of architecture. And yes, we are very busy trying to keep the buildings that are architecturally and culturally to our city standing. You know, for years, it used to be just watching buildings downtown in the Loop and along a slender strip of Lake Michigan, use Lakeshore Drive, some of those neighborhoods adjoining it with Lake Michigan views, which are fabulous. But now we're noticing that those areas that we traditionally were worried about in the past, let's say from the very beginning of the 20th century or mid 20th century on, those are not the buildings that we're mostly chasing these days. We're chasing buildings that are under threat in our wonderful neighborhoods that are being oftentimes first-class buildings that are being replaced by third-class buildings. Not always, but oftentimes. When it's a developer formula building that replaces a historic structure of great note in Chicago, we're on the scene usually.
Well, as head of a major preservation organization like that, you obviously can't save everything. So how do you determine which ones you're going to go to bat for?
We research newspapers. We have a really fabulous board of directors that represents almost every neighborhood in the city or every region of the city. And then we also have a staff that keeps tabs on everything we're looking at. And then we have a list of about 200 buildings that are currently sort of on our watch list. We do research on them. We oftentimes suggest them for landmarks. If we get a Chicago landmark designation, which is the only way to really protect a building with teeth in the city of Chicago, we're always at Commission on Chicago Landmark hearings. We're always at Independent Voice. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We give it all away pro bono. So every service we offer, we give away free. And we're supported by individuals and foundations. We write grants for our positions. And recently I was blessed with a $2.3 million endowment from the Richard H. Driehaus Foundation. So I now carry his name in my title. I'm the Richard H. Driehaus Executive Director of Preservation
You're
Chicago.
like a tenured professor, right? Like a chair at a university.
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's correct. And that was the idea. And Richard was a dear friend of ours. He tragically lost him 3 years ago, unexpectedly. So I helped to carry his name and his legacy, along with the other programs and other organizations and other people that are associated with the Driehaus Foundation, Driehaus Museum, and Driehaus Fellows around the world.
Well, I have a very general Chicago planning question for you. I've always admired the city for just one simple reason, that unlike a lot of places in America, both your major airports are accessible by rail. LA hasn't figured that out. LaGuardia hasn't figured that out. How come Chicago did that and did that pretty early on?
Right. Well, I think various administrations really took pride in that. I remember when the Blue Line, as we call it now, used to run under a different name. It stopped at Jefferson Park, and then you had to take a bus to O'Hare. But usually there were limousines and taxis that took you there. And then the Midway Line, the Orange Line, really opened in the last 25 or so years. And those airports both have been around for a long time. So, it's possible for New York and Los Angeles to catch up with us. These airports weren't necessarily designed with that transit system running into them, but it's been really wonderful to have that accessibility. And I do take the Blue Line to O'Hare. The Orange Line is a little more difficult from where I live to get to Midway, and usually I'm too much in a hurry to get across town. That's a further airport from my house. So, but I do love the idea that it makes it a little more accessible for everybody rather than spending, $40, $50, $60 on a ride from O'Hare or Midway downtown or to your house. And I have to say, I'm going to New York later this week, and I'm expecting a $50 or $60 cab ride from LaGuardia to Midtown Manhattan. So,
oh yeah, during surge pricing, it's like 110. So,
well, I guess Preservation Chicago is going to be shocked to see that.
What buildings is Preservation Chicago working on now to save?
For the fifth year in a row, we're focusing on two buildings on State Street, that great street, one of Chicago's principal thoroughfares. And at one time when I was growing up, Chicago's most important street to many of us as residents. And that's the 16-story Century building and the 22-story Consumers buildings. And they're both owned by the General Services Administration, or GSA. That's the real estate arm of the federal government. And these two buildings were determined to be too close to the Dirksen Federal Courthouse, which is a glass and steel building and complex designed by Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. And Mies very much learned from these structures and admired these early works of the Chicago School of Architecture. And his building in Plaza, the Federal Center Plaza, opens up to the Marquette building, which is a wonderful Holabird and Roche building. The Kulizinski building aligns with the Monadnock building. And then the front entry to the Dirksen Federal Center was through Quincy Court, which is flanked by this consumer building, 22 stories, and the Benson Rickson Circle, which is our modern building from 1937 by Alfred Altschuler. And ironically, the Century and Consumers buildings have been deemed worthy of demolition, I guess, because they're so close. They're fearful of an attack on the courthouse, perhaps. But you have to understand that by demolishing one or both of these buildings, or any of these buildings, that you're also impacting the Mies van der Rohe Federal Center and Mies's larger vision. So you're not only losing potentially two works of art, the last of the steel frame buildings constructed before World War I, and to lose them to a $52 million congressional earmark that we have been fighting. And these buildings were acquired over 18 years ago by the GSA. And there was a promise that they were going to take these two buildings and co-join them and make this another federal center building. That just never happened. And that's unfortunate. It has led to 18 years of basically deferred maintenance, vacancy, and neglect. And over the course of probably about 15 federal Section 106 meetings, we were able to finally get a record of determination stating that the GSA is now open to the idea of reusing these buildings. So we have a couple of ideas of how these buildings could be reused, and one is, of course, the tried and true method of turning office buildings into residential structures, which we've seen time and time again. We have an unusual idea here at Preservation Chicago, which has gained a lot of momentum, and that is to make this an archive center so that basically you could have an archive on each floor that could be locked off and protected. And since archives are light sensitive, you could block any problematic windows that GSA officials say are an issue from the interior side of the building, so it would not impact the exterior of the structures. So we're very excited about it. We also have these two buildings in the Chicago landmarks process. They need a lot of repairs made to them, and the City of Chicago is sometimes very careful about landmarking buildings that need a lot of repair because they don't want to be in a situation where a landmark building is demolished due to life safety issues. So that's one. And then we also have a group of industrial buildings, the Ogden Keeler Group, which is on Route 66, otherwise known as Ogden Avenue in Chicago, where Route 66 begins. Here's a group that wants to take these three wonderful buildings, two of them by Alfred Altschuler, one by R.C. Fletcher, and demolish them for a cross truck dock. And again, on Route 66. And do we want that kind of development to be on Route 66 is the question. And do we want all those toxic fumes from a cross truck dock or a logistics facility? I think not. And the neighborhood is pushing back. And there's a demolition permit on these buildings, but it's still one of our Chicago 7 most endangered, as is the Sheffield Belden Group, a group of 5 buildings, 4 Victorian townhouses, 1 courtyard building. It's threatened by an expansion of DePaul University for an athletic facility when they have a vacant parcel, a surface parking lot, a block away, closer to the Red Line train station. It seems like there's better options to place this building. Then we have CVS, which is Chicago Vocational High School, not the drugstore. And Chicago Vocational is an amazing Art Deco complex. It's just the most beautiful facades and a wing that runs down South Anthony Avenue, parallel to the Chicago Skyway, which is threatened with demolition. And this was the shops building. This is where they, during the war, they built airplanes, believe it or not. And they had shops for, mechanical and electrical systems, and just an amazing building. And, what a waste to see this building considered for demolition. So we're encouraging an expansion of CVS's programs once again. And if for some reason that can't be achieved, maybe we can think of some other option for this wing that would engage the community and creating a better city and encouraging more investment in the neighborhood.
Ward, I understand that you have a favorite building that has the nickname, the Goth Target. What is that?
So that's the old Schlesinger and Mayer store, designed by Louis Sullivan. Later became known as Carson Perry Scott and Company, one of the great department stores of Chicago. It features an amazingly elaborate two-story base with this incredible foliated ornament that Sullivan was so known for, and executed by Christian Schneider and George Elmsley. And then a pure white terracotta building above and crowned by an amazingly elaborate cornice and fascia at the top level. And this is one of those modernist buildings built in that period of 1899 to 1904. Not exactly what you think of as a modernist period, but it was, of course, at the time. And Louis Sullivan really stretched the limits of the spans, the terracotta, the cast iron. And it's just one of those buildings that just sings. And every time you see the Carson Perry Scott store, Schlesinger and Mayer building, now called Sullivan Center, just a beautiful sight. And it sort of changes with the sunlight and the different color tones of the day. And it's no longer a department store. It does have a Target store on its lower two levels. But up above are various offices, including several architectural offices. And from that building springs designs of tall buildings around the world. But Chicago, America's city of architecture, exports a lot of these great building designs that you see around the world. Some of these incredible superstructures emanate from Chicago, and many of them from this building. And there's something very beautiful about being surrounded by an incredible environment and being in a Louis Sullivan design structure.
But why is it called the Goth Target?
Well, I think the general public probably sees this incredibly foliated two-story base as being maybe indescribable, and it's painted a sort of a dark, rich olive green, and I think that inspires that particular term, if you will, that was given to it.
It looks steampunk, goth.
You say so.
Yeah.
In my mind's eye, it's a gorgeous building, representing the best of.
Oh, I know, but that's because you're the executive director of Preservation Chicago. Of course, you're going to say that. But it can still be a Goth Target and be wonderful, right?
Absolutely, George. We embrace this. However, people need to embrace these buildings and love them. We're on board. And whether you're an architectural historian or just a shopper going into a Target store, it moves you. And you realize you're in someplace special, and that in itself is really fabulous and wonderful.
The website is preservationchicago.org. Thanks for talking with me, Ward.
Absolutely, George.
That was George with historian Ward Miller. Born in Rome, Justin Davidson began his impressive career as a freelancer for the Associated Press in Italy. Today, Justin is a Pulitzer Prize-winning design and music critic with a regular column in New York Magazine. He is the author of the book Magnetic City, A Walking Companion to New York. And when he's not writing about architecture and classical music, Justin is a talented composer writing cinquantellets. I think that's right, during his time at Columbia. Here's George's conversation with Justin Davidson, where he tries to nail that pronunciation down.
Justin, let's start out with a word that I cannot pronounce. I'm going to try it, and I want you to tell me what it is. Cinquintetlets?
Cinquintetlets. Oh boy, that's a word from a long time ago.
Yeah. What is that?
This is 5 little pieces. It's a neologism. I made up that word. It's just basically quintets, 5 of them, and they're all very small. So it's just a portmanteau word of putting together those 5 and small. And they're just a little set of pieces that I wrote many years ago.
So you composed this, I think, while you were at Columbia. Yes,
I was a graduate student in composition, and I composed a fair amount of music at that point. But that feels like another life, I have to say.
Now, the expression has always been that architecture is frozen music, right? That's what gets bandied about. So how did you make the transition from music to architecture?
They were really very separate parts of my life. I mean, I grew up in Rome, and so I was sort of always interested in the city, and I biked around a lot as a teenager, and I had a big map of the city up in my bedroom and sort of like knocked off routes and landmarks. And I had a teacher in high school who was a historian of Rome, an architectural historian, who just happened to be teaching high school, although later on he was teaching at the college level. And so that was kind of a wonderful immersion into the architecture and urbanism of Rome. But for me, it was just kind of like the place that I lived, and I loved it. But it really was just a kind of private part of my life. It wasn't something that I pursued, academically or professionally later on. I was all in with music. I was a classical guitarist, a composer, and it wasn't until later when I was working at a newspaper at Newsday as a music critic that I took advantage of the fact that classical music criticism in the newspaper was sort of not a really essential part of the publication. And that left me a lot of freedom to kind of break away, especially in summers, and do other kinds of projects. And so that was when I kind of revived my interest in architecture and sort of went back to it, and just really tried to deepen it. And by that time, I was already a journalist. So it really was a really different chapter in my life. It wasn't until I moved to New York Magazine in 2007 that those two things really kind of aligned, because they really wanted both. And so I had built up a bit of a beat at Newsday in architecture, but it was still kind of like, secondary. And then when I moved to New York Magazine, it was clear that actually their primary interest was really in architecture and urbanism and what I did. And so especially at the beginning, I was really trying to balance them both. But I didn't think of them as interlocking disciplines. That frozen music thing didn't make a lot of sense to me, except when I thought about the architecture around music, that is the relationship between music and the spaces that it has always been created for and heard in. When I started to think about that made a lot of sense to me. But that's a kind of limited overlap. I do really think of them as very separate things. And to me, the big difference is the way time works, because your experience of music is one of letting time pass that you're not controlling, and you have a series of experiences that is being given to you by the composer or the musicians, and you are remembering what you just heard, you're associating with other things, but it's this sort of like time that's going past you and through you. In architecture, time works on multiple scales, right? It works in terms of your experience of the building as you move through it and around it, but you're controlling that. You can move at different paces. You can stop and see different things. And then time operates on a kind of much larger scale in terms of how the building or a city evolves or ages over time. But then you're talking about decades or centuries. And so to me, those things are really operate quite differently.
Well, you must go crazy when you have to go review a new symphony hall.
Well, I find that quite difficult because in the journalistic kind of tradition, right? But everybody wants to know. It's like, what does it sound like? When they build a new hall, they spend hundreds of millions of dollars on that, and it's all about the sound, right? If a new hall doesn't sound good, then those hundreds of millions of dollars are wasted. So it's got to sound good. So the question is always like, you go to the first concert, there's the big opening and it's like, how does it sound? But sound and music don't work that way. The relationship between the musicians and the hall and the architecture is one that evolves. Different kinds of music sound different. Musicians respond to the architecture in different ways over time. So do the ears. So it's hard because it's not something you can pin down right away. It takes some time, in my experience, to figure out how a hall sounds. You may have an initial impression, but that initial impression is made up of so many complex elements that it's hard to disentangle them. So what I found is it's not going to review a new hall. It's like being in one over time, you start to kind of get a feeling for it.
So are there any examples you can think of where you've got a really lousy building but great sound, or you've got an amazing building but terrible sound?
Well, that sort of depends what you mean by an amazing building, right?
Right.
To me, an amazing building is one that satisfies all its functions amazingly and gives you a complete experience inside and out. That is this combination of the aesthetic and the social and the historical and the specific purpose.
I mean, sort of like, from a chorus line, dance 10 looks 3 kind of thing.
Yeah, I would say that my memory of going to Kimmel in Philadelphia that Raphael Vignoli designed, which is the home of the Philadelphia Orchestra, was really problematic. I mean, it had this kind of like warm, like cello-like interior. It felt like you were sitting inside a string instrument, but it didn't sound that way. Now, I haven't been there in a while, and I know that they've made lots of adjustments, but I'm talking about the sort of early impressions were like walking in and feeling very comfortable, and then the music starts, and you're like, I can't get this right. Like, this just sounds off.
Yeah.
But again, that's because in part the musicians have to get used to it too, and things like adjustments have to be made over time.
And I assume the opposite is true too, that you have halls that are kind of like dive bars, but they got the sound right by some accident and it sounds great.
Yeah. Trying to think of an example of that. I've heard concerts in both of the tents that get used during the summer at the Aspen Festival in Colorado.
Yeah.
One of them was the original one, I believe, was Saarinen, and it was, it's just a tent that's open on the side. I judge sound by the experience you have of the music. Like, sound is not a separate thing. It's not like the music was great, but it sounded bad. That can't exist. The sound is the musical experience that you have. It's the whole thing. So I've had some great experiences in that tent. And the truth is that even in Geffen Hall or what was Avery Fisher Hall, which was always unsatisfying. And, I like the exterior architecture of Lincoln Center quite a lot. The hall inside was never particularly pleasing and had huge acoustic problems. But I have to say, like, over the years, I've had a lot of great experiences there too.
Did you ever get a chance to listen to a concert on Lou Kahn's concert boat?
No.
That is supposed to be really quite extraordinary. And they're restoring it now, I think, somewhere down in Florida, trying to bring it back online. Let's change tack a little bit. Let's talk about one of the biggest projects, I think, ever in New York City, which is Hudson Yards. And you've written extensively about this over the years. It is what, like 50 billion, some astronomical number like that?
Yeah, I don't actually remember what the overall budget was, but the key budget to me was the billions that it took to simply create the platform on which the rest of the development rose. Because it was the scale of that which meant that the city decided that it was best to offload the risk of doing that. It was more than the city could undertake on its own, or with public financing, or even with bonds. It was necessary to have the private sector do that infrastructure work. And the only way that they saw to make that work was to hand over that entire site to a single developer. which turned out to be Related.
The related companies.
So Related was the entity that capitalized that, took the risk of doing that infrastructure, and then in exchange was basically able to control the entire development. That to me was kind of a devil's bargain because you're turning over a big chunk of the future city to a single entity, a private company, and you lose a lot of control. But you also lose a lack of control in a way, right? If you create infrastructure, like the way the city was built was you create kind of the grid, the basic unit, and then you break it up. And whatever mistakes get made are made locally. It's like there may be one bad building or one poorly constructed building, but the one next to it will be fine. Or just cumulatively, everything kind of has a certain messiness that is a very urban quality. So it's not even the control. As I say, it's the lack of control that you lose when you turn it over to a developer. The city loses any kind of control except what's sort of in the zoning, but the developer has total control, and that basically makes it kind of branded real estate. And I think that's what you wound up getting was a corporate product. And that's a very different thing from building a city.
For those of you that don't know what Hudson Yards is, it's a giant railroad yard on the west side of New York that is open or was open, and lots of tracks. And this infrastructure that Justin's referring to is basically building a giant platform over top of it, right, upon which they're building buildings and other structures so that the railroads still function down below, right?
It was a huge engineering challenge because you couldn't stop the railroad traffic. Like that had to continue unabated. And so all of the construction had to work around it. I should say there's actually two different sections. There's the eastern yards and the western yards. The eastern yards have been decked over. There are now buildings there. It's a part of New York. The western yards are still open because even though Related has the development rights, they actually haven't built anything there yet. So that's still open to the air.
Okay.
The project.
And if you look online, you'll see these very tall buildings. What, about 8 or 10 of them that have been built on the site?
Yeah, there seem to be more every time I look.
And this thing, which I still find inexplicable, called the Vessel. So what is the Vessel all about, and why did they want to spend $200 million to build it?
I believe it was $350 million.
Wow. Okay.
Okay, so I think we need to back up a little bit here.
Yeah.
Because, as I said, Related controlled the whole site. The idea behind what they were going to do was to recruit a bunch of different architects who would operate semi-independently, but all for the same client, to create a shopping mall, office buildings, a residential building, and a cultural center, which is the Shed. The way that had to be done was in a sort of basically in a circle around a public space. That's the way it was zoned. So there was a kind of like master plan that Related had to follow, but that left them a lot of leeway. That public space at the heart of it was undefined, and the design of that came in later. So the real question to me was, from the beginning, was how good are we, or how good is the city? How good is a collection of architects? How good is the sort of culture of urban space, of urban design at this scale, at creating a really good public space out of a perimeter of skyscrapers, given the constraints in design and in materials? So we knew from the get-go we were basically going to get a set of curtain wall buildings, glass fronted, most like a lot of glass. And I really had doubts about how well you could envelop people in a new public space, given those constraints, given the kind of scale and the distance between the buildings and the way you approached it. They had a lot going for it because the High Line, which is this elevated park made out of railroad tracks, I'm sure your listeners are probably pretty familiar with that, terminates there. And so it funnels people, pedestrians who are coming at an elevated level and coming straight into this plaza, which is elevated above the street level because it has to go over those tracks. So from the beginning, I think the issue was, how do you create this public space given the pieces of architecture all around it? And I think that Steve Ross, who was the chairman of Related, understood, because he was told, that he needed to find a way to define that public space. And his idea was to do it with an artwork, to do it with a kind of public sculpture. And when I talked to him, I think this was around 2012, I remember he said, well, what we really want is something like the Trevi Fountain of New York.
Mm-hmm.
I said, is that really what you have in mind? Because the Trevi Fountain is attached to the side of a building. It is huge compared to the scale of the public space in front of it. It actually has this spectacular function that relates to a practical one. It's the end of an aqueduct, brings in water. That's why it's a fountain. And it has entrances from various different sides, so you can approach it laterally or frontally. And I couldn't quite understand what he had in mind. And I think that was the problem. So the vessel, which was designed by Thomas Heatherwick to be a collection of Escher-like staircases that you could climb up and down and around.
People called it the Eiffel Tower of New York for a while.
Well, he called it the Eiffel Tower. Once I kind of challenged him on the Trevi Fountain analogy, he started calling it the Eiffel Tower of New York. And that also doesn't make sense in terms of a way to anchor the space around it, the way of creating a social space. And so I think that it was meant to compensate for an approach that left the public space as kind of an afterthought. There was landscaping by Thomas Woltz, which was limited by the fact that it's built on top of a platform, so there's fairly little depth. So the engineering of trying to put in plantings is challenging. There's heat coming up from the trains, so that was also an issue. So all of these constraints were, I think the idea was to solve them in one stroke by putting up this big artwork, and it was an experiential artwork. The problem to me is that it patently doesn't serve any purpose. It's sort of a place that you climb to get a view, but the views are really of nothing much. In its essence, because the way to experience it is to climb and descend stairs, it is fundamentally discriminatory against people who can't do that. So they put in an elevator, which you can take up to a landing. You get out of the elevator, there's a little landing there, and then you go back into the elevator and you go down. So that's not really an experience of any kind. It's
wait a second.
limited.
So you can't exit the elevator and then go down the stairs?
You could, but if you're in a wheelchair,
Right.
you can take an elevator, get out, but then there's nowhere to go because there's only stairs. So it's fundamentally for the young and able-bodied, which in an urban environment, I think is not really acceptable. The other problem that developed very quickly was that it became a place that attracted at least a few people who saw it as a place to solve their problems by ending their lives. And so in the space of 18 months, 4 different people jumped off this structure.
Yeah, I've always wondered about that because at least I don't hear that about something like the Eiffel Tower, for instance. Maybe they do have people jumping off the Eiffel Tower, but the vessels seem to attract this kind of people right away.
Well, yeah, the history of the Eiffel Tower and many other similar kinds of icons with steep drops beneath them ought to have alerted the designers and the builders of the vessel that this would be a problem. Because basically, like where there are bridges over gorges or deep rivers, especially sort of spectacular and iconic ones, people will jump, and they did jump from the Eiffel Tower, and the Eiffel Tower has that history too. And many years ago, they dealt with it by putting up, all kinds of guards, making it difficult or impossible to do. And this was something that was not designed in from the beginning, which meant that they had to deal with the problem retroactively.
They put some giant fencing around it now, haven't they?
Yeah, well, the first one they ignored. After the second one, they said, well, it was free, and they instituted a paid ticket policy. I guess they thought that a $10 entrance fee would somehow dissuade people. Then after the third one, they said, well, you can't go there alone. You have to go with somebody else.
Buddy system, right.
Which led to a teenager jumping off in front of his family.
Oh, God, wow.
At which point they closed it. And it was closed for several years because they couldn't really figure out how to salvage this issue. And now they've basically wrapped part of it and reopened part of it in chicken wire, basically, sort of high-grade steel mesh, which creates its own set of problems. to me, kind of the way they handled it and the solution they've wound up with is both inevitable and also kind of ham-fisted. Sort of highlights the pointlessness of the thing to begin with.
Well, you've been writing about architecture now a long time. Do you find that you're having influence with development in New York? Are some of the people who are the movers and shakers taking note of your observations and incorporating those in their new projects?
I don't know. It's impossible for me to assess that. I mean, I hear that people in urban planning and in the city and in the development world, they do read what I write.
Mm-hmm.
What they take away from it or how it changes their thinking. By the time I'm writing about something, it's very hard to establish a causality. I think that I've had some measure of, I can't even call it impact. I've been part of the conversation along with many other people on, say, street safety, street design, the development of pedestrian areas. That's something that I and my colleagues at Curbed, which is the website, the urbanism website at New York Magazine, we've emphasized a lot. We've done a lot of writing about that. And I think that that's entered the conversation, and I think it's been part of how that thinking is going. But I don't think you can draw a direct line between something I wrote and somebody changing their minds about something.
Okay.
At least I can't perceive that.
Well, as our listeners know, one of the architects we follow all the time is Bjarke Ingels. And you've written about his firm's projects and the dilemma of being a revolutionary versus just getting jobs done. That it seems like on the one hand, people want a revolution in their cities. They want interesting buildings, but they don't want them too revolutionary. How do you balance all that when you're writing your columns?
One of the issues that I've had to deal with, because I've so heavily focused on New York specifically, is that New York is a great city and it's got some great architecture in it and it's great urbanistically, but it's a very difficult place for architects to come from other places and do their best work. Everybody wants to work here, but they don't often do their best work here. I think that has to do with a combination of the constraints, the density, the culture, the just ability to navigate the development world. And the fact that there are so many pre-existing conditions that go into the making of a building. By the time you've lined up the zoning, the building code, the square footage, the commercial considerations, the supply chain, the lending process, the regulations, all of those things, you're handed, as an architect, you're kind of handed a prepackaged 80% design. Mm-hmm. And your job is often to either challenge that and push back or to just find a nice way to dress that up. It's tough to be a radical in New York. There are multiple ways of dealing with that. Some architects, like I think, Herzog & de Meuron are a good example at their tower at 56 Leonard. They waited for kind of just the right project, did one thing that looks really quite extraordinary on the skyline. It's a sort of like Jenga tower of cantilevered apartments.
Yeah.
Get a developer to spend that kind of money to do something that could more easily have been done, in a traditional way, is maybe something that requires the market value of New York real estate. Then you get, like a building like one by an architect I admire tremendously, Álvaro Siza, the Portuguese architect, who's done fantastic work in Portugal. He was asked to come here and do a residential tower, and he had his long career behind him. He was a man in his 80s. And basically what he was left with was designing a facade for, layouts that somebody else designed. And it's by no means his best work. Ingels is an interesting kind of compromise there because he developed a lot of his ideas. He was educated in Denmark and did some really, really interesting, beautiful projects there, and very quickly became kind of a global superstar. He became a global superstar by making his clients happy. And in New York, what that means is making a building that fits into all of these systems I was describing. He did the Via on West 57th Street. The people call it a pyramidal building. It's not really pyramidal, but triangle shaped. And that I think is a really interesting approach to dealing with the zoning, the views, the sort of modular construction. It was courtyard building, and that had a lot of interesting features. His work since then has just been a lot more compromised, in my view. Not bad, but just not as special as I think he imagines it to be.
It is hard in New York because of the constraints, as you said.
Yeah.
What buildings are you looking forward to, Justin, being built in this next couple of years?
Well, we seem to be headed for a slowdown. It's a little bit hard to tell because there's so many cranes on the skyline, but they're completing buildings that were, designed and paid for or begun years ago. So now I think we're going to get a real slowdown from the high interest rates and issues from a couple of years ago. But there are a few issues that I'm looking forward to seeing how they work out. One is the conversions of office buildings to residential. I think that'll be interesting to watch. SOM is doing a climate center on Governor's Island, which is going to be largely mass timber. And I think that's a really important, almost literally stake in the ground, because I think New York has a long way to go to really make mass timber more a part of the urban landscape. And Governor's Island is kind of a good place to try that. So that's something I'm really looking forward to seeing. Next spring, there's a new ice rink and swimming pool and building combination in the north end of Central Park, which will be kind of a really interesting interweaving of landscape and neighborhood because it's near some underserved parts of the park. So it's about sort of integrating the park with that neighborhood, making people in Harlem feel like that Central Park is really theirs. I'm curious about how the Studio Museum in Harlem winds up being. That's a David Adjaye design. And as we know, a lot of people walked away from David Adjaye after he had issues of sexual scandal. And so it's not clear what the future of his practice is, but he had already designed the Studio Museum, and that's going to be completed next year. And then the thing that is not clear, like what that's going to look like, is Frida Escobedo is doing the modern wing at the Metropolitan Museum. So that's going to be one project I'm really curious to see.
If New York can build the Vessel and Hudson Yards and Supertalls and renovate LaGuardia and JFK, why can't they get a subway link to LaGuardia?
New York is this incredible paradox of very large scale ambition and an almost infinite ability to settle for good enough or not quite good enough, and also to defer hard decisions. So you can look at New York through one keyhole and just see this incredibly dynamic, forward-looking city of prosperity and wealth and high technology. You can move over a few inches and look through a different keyhole, and what you see is a city that is really running on the fumes of the 19th or early 20th century and hasn't upgraded its transit infrastructure and is just kind of limping along, still has fairly primitive sanitation collection, garbage collection, and has given up on lots of ambitious projects. And I think that one of the issues is that overall, New York has a hard time defining what its role is now. I think there's a kind of identity crisis going on. To answer more specifically about LaGuardia, I think the problem with all of these things is that the costs are extremely high to do basic infrastructure work in New York, especially tunneling, many times higher than the same project would be, say, in Paris or Hong Kong. And so I think that's a real impediment. There's the underground system is so complex that, there's a lot of issues to be sorted out. But then also we just have a kind of environment where whatever you do, somebody objects.
Yeah.
And in a democratic system, those objections really force things to just slide down the road, the easiest thing to do. Because when it takes too much time and it costs too much, the politicians who are going to finally get the thing moving are not going to be around for the ribbon cutting. And so there's really very little, impetus for someone to really go out on a limb and push for it.
Well, I have an idea, and you're welcome to steal it, Justin, if you want. But I'm thinking that you just extend the N and W lines in Astoria out over the water to Rikers Island, which they're going to close, and then just run that over the other little body of water to LaGuardia. So no tunneling involved at all. That's my easy answer from here in North Carolina.
I think there's one other sort of concrete thing that we got to put our finger on, which is that the traditional way to extend transportation infrastructure is to pay for it through future development. It's the combination of the eventual profits that will come from real estate and the new development. The problem is that so much of New York is built out that it's hard to find places where the transportation extension is going to wind up paying for itself, or that there's a mechanism for paying for it. The exception to that is the extension of the number 7 to Hudson Yards, because that was basically creating a whole new neighborhood. And it's not just the related development, but that whole sort of area. But to give you an idea of the limitations, the number 7 comes from 42nd Street and then curves down to 34th. So there really should have been a stop at 42nd Street and 10th Avenue before it goes south to 34th Street. There wasn't the money to pay for that, even in the sort of fancy financing that the Bloomberg administration came up with. So they created the shell for a station, but they didn't actually create the station. So theoretically, at some point, you could put that in, but what's the incentive? Who's going to do it for what incentive?
Right.
So from the incentive of riders and New Yorkers, it would be great to have everything that you've talked about. And it would certainly be great to have a direct subway or direct ride to LaGuardia. Other cities seem to be able to manage this. London and Paris have connected their airports quite well. But in New York, it's just the financing mechanisms are also kind of a block.
Well, Justin, this has been fascinating. I could talk with you for a lot longer, but I appreciate your time with me, and thanks so much for coming on the show.
Well, thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Eddie Mugavero is a singer, songwriter, artist, producer, publisher, and founder of the all-too short-lived Nashville swing band, Bada Bing Bada Boom. Eddie started writing songs and touring in the 70s with acts like Greg Allman, The Temptations, Pure Prairie League, The Four Tops, The Four Seasons, Merle Haggard, and the Marshall Tucker Band. In the 90s, his song That's What I Like About the North, which we'll hear later, was featured on Lynn Marie's Grammy-nominated album Party Dress. In 2000, Eddie appeared in the documentary Country Music, The Spirit of America, alongside Martina McBride, and in 2004, he contributed to the film High Roller, the Stu Unger story. Since 2005, Eddie has collaborated with former Bada Bing Bada Boom bandmate, that's fun to say, Rebecca Sayer. He writes lyrics for her music. Welcome, Eddie.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Eddie, I understand that there was a seminal moment for you back when the Beatles were on Ed Sullivan. Tell me about that.
That's correct. I was 10 years old, and just like every other kid in America, we were glued to the TV on February 9th, 1964, and I was just mesmerized. I was like, wow, this is pretty cool. And subsequently, I started secretly learning how to play piano. We had a piano in our house, and I would.
How do you learn that secretly,
chords.
Eddie?
Yeah, really?
Well, because my family would be out of the house or something, and I'd just sneak in and plunk around on it and learn. I would get these Beatle books. They had song books, and
Oh, my God.
I would figure out the chords and learn how to sing. And
Eddie, this is exactly, I did the same thing. I watched with my babysitter when I was 9 years old, and later on, I bought all those books with the chords.
Right.
Learned how to play guitar chords on the piano.
Right.
Go on.
Well, then, I realized I couldn't lug a piano around to parties, and so I somehow obtained a little guitar and transposed those songs into guitar chords, and pretty soon I was just the Beatle guy. I was singing all the Beatles songs, and that's basically how I learned theory and songwriting. And I think that John and Paul revolutionized pop songwriting.
Did your parents let you grow out your hair?
No, that was the one thing. Well, I did have the bangs and stuff, but that was as far as they would let me go. But I would, I'd play my broom in the mirror and just, this is But, my story is not unique. It's every musician I know, or my age anyway, traces that moment.
Yeah.
And, the surge in musical instrument sales was crazy in 64, 65, 66. Everybody was getting guitars and drums. And they said, if these four guys from Liverpool can do it, why can't we? And that's pretty much everybody's story if you ask. And I've always loved music. I was surrounded by music in my house. My mom was a classical music fanatic, and my dad loved big bands. So I was subject to the Great American Songbook, the Cole Porters and all those guys, and then the melodies of Beethoven and Mozart. And then I began studying the Tin Pan Alley songwriters, the Carole Kings and the Brill Building songwriters,
Right.
who wrote all the pop hits in the late 50s and early 60s. So I was just a combination of all my influences that led to me starting to write songs. I realized I was never going to be another George Harrison guitar player or Paul McCartney bass player. So I said, I better start writing some of my own songs. If you can't be the best, you be the first. So I would say, okay, these are my songs.
Well, we're going to talk about the band in a minute, but here is Bada Bing Bada Boom's title song track from their album Volume 2.
Everybody swing. Bada bing, bada boom. Don't swing that thing, don't need a little room. Bada bing, bada boom. Bada bing, bada boom. Everybody 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Bada bing, bada boom. When you hear the sound, everybody get down, kick your shoes off, pitch a little woo. Pick your partner, carver off to the wood floor's good for your heart. Let's go. Everybody swing now.
Everybody swing now.
Bada bing, bada boom. Don't swing that thing, don't need a little room. Bada bing, bada boom. Bada bing, bada boom. Everybody 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Bada bing, bada boom. When you hear the song, everybody come along, throw your hips out, pat your lips. Kiss on your mate, your date, your a winner, spin a solo. Let's go. Everybody swing now.
Everybody swing now.
Bada bing, bada boom. Don't swing that thing, don't need a little room. Bada bing, bada boom. Bada bing, bada boom. Everybody 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Bada bing, bada boom. Don't sing in harmony, no harm needing someone solos, no fun. Shake it like a loose goose, follow me. Hoochie, coochie, 1, 2, 3. Bada bing, bada boom. Don't swing that thing, don't need a little room. Bada bing, bada boom. Bada bing, bada boom. Everybody 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Bada bing, bada boom. Well, bada bing, bada boom. Don't swing that thing, don't need a little room. Bada bing, bada boom. Bada bing, bada boom. Everybody 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Bada bing, bada boom. Let's anybody 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Bada bing, bada boom. Everybody 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Bada bing, bada boom. Bada bing, bada boom.
Who is the fiddler in there?
That makes me smile. His name is Stephen Dudash. He's still in Nashville, and he's a virtuoso,
He's
gifted
fast.
viola
Yeah.
player.
And is that you singing the lead there, Eddie?
That is the 1 or 2 songs they let me sing per album. Yes. Because I had 2 girls that were phenomenal. They sang harmony on most of the stuff, and every now and then they'd say, "Eddie, you sing one." And yeah, My bass player told me to write Bada Bing, but he said, write a song called Bada Bing Bada Boom, Eddie. We need one. I said, okay.
Have you ever seen The Sopranos?
Well, we predated The Sopranos, and everybody asked where that name came from. We were in 95, and they didn't come around until 97 or 98.
You're right, yeah.
I actually got the Bada Bing from the Godfather movie when Sonny was talking to Michael about shooting the cop. He says, you got to get right up and Bada Bing,
Right.
I said, that's a good name for a band. So that's how that became.
Now, I had the pleasure of seeing Bada Boom Bada Bing live. They came to Durham, North Carolina for an outdoor street festival in the mid-'90s.
Correct.
And it was great because the music was really so original. Eddie's songs have very carefully crafted lyrics. And, you're coming down the street and you're hearing these songs, and people were just bursting into dancing right in front of that.
I always loved rhyme, rhythm and rhyme. And even as a kid, as a 5th, 6th grader, I was writing poems and just was fascinated by rhythm and rhyme. And I always said that every song that we do is going to be positive. You go through my catalog, there's not one negative song. Everything is happy.
Here's an example of Eddie's great lyrics. This song is called Nothing Rhymes, and this is Rebecca Serra on lead, right?
That's correct, yeah.
Since my baby's gone, nothing rhymes. The clock on the wall tells me it's late and nothing matters anymore. Since the day you closed the book and the birds are blue, when I hear them sing as I wait by the phone, but it don't work. Now I'm so sad without my baby that nothing rhymes. Well, I start to cry when I hear your name. I only have myself to talk to. I'm as blue as I can be. I wonder why you set me up, or just so you could do me wrong. Now my life's like an old Merle Haggard tune, 'cause I'm so sad without my baby that nothing rhymes. Saying I don't need you, I've got my dog. I'm a princess, you're a fool, and soon you'll miss me and you'll call. Maybe summer, maybe winter, maybe spring or autumn. Not a chance, 'cause I've got plans. I'll be dancing and romancing with a brand new man. Oh, what do you know?
Talk about timing.
Well, I've got to go.
Everything's rhyming.
I'm moving on. Those days are gone when nothing rhymes.
Well, what do you know?
Talk about your timing.
She gotta go.
I mean, 'cause
I haven't heard that in years. That's great.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you.
I love the lyrical touch that early on she's saying, and she's waiting by the phone, but it don't work. It's like I'm expecting ring.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you the impetus of that song. When I first came to Nashville, I was a song evaluator for the Nashville Songwriters Association.
Uh-huh.
And members would send in their tapes, and I would turn it over after I listened to it, and I'd critique it, and then I'd send it back to them. But I always marveled how young writers would telegraph a rhyme,
Yeah.
but not hit it. It was like running into a brick wall. Like, I'm waiting for the rhyme, and they don't do it. But it wasn't on purpose that they didn't do it.
Yeah. Well, that was a nice touch.
Thank you.
Eddie, what happened to Bada Bing Bada Boom? How did they end?
Well, we just ran our course here in Nashville. We were a country or a swing pop, whatever you wanted to call us, band in a country town, and we just didn't think we'd ever get a record deal out of Nashville. And we played everywhere. As a matter of fact, all the country stars would hire us to do their parties. We played Faith Hill's birthday party for Tim McGraw. We would play the CMA private party events. So we were like the band everybody wanted to hear.
Huh.
But we just couldn't land a big deal out of town, And after 7 years, we got the itch, and we just said, let's move on. Let's pack it in, and we'll all do something else. So that's what we did. And now and then we'll throw together a reunion show.
That's like the Eagles.
Yeah.
Put me on a list, Eddie, because I would really love to see you guys perform again.
Well, we're getting older, and my trumpet player, he's about to turn 80, if he hasn't already. And he says, Eddie, if you ever want to do a show, you give me 2 months in advance notice so I can get my lip back in shape, because, that's a grueling instrument to play for 4 hours. And, of course, I'd have to go back and relearn all my songs. But we're threatening to do it. People are clamoring for another reunion. So who knows? It may happen.
Eddie, thanks for being on the show so much. As we go out, we're going to play one of your most innovative tunes. It's really hilarious. I love this song, even though I'm from the South. Here is Bada Bing Bada Boom with That's What I Like About the North.
Great Lakes up in Michigan, fish all day, then fish again. On the North Star, wish again, that's what I like about the North. Pierogies, hoagies, pretzel carts, cheesesteaks, clam bakes, Reggie bars. There's Camden Yards, Fenway Park, that's what I like about the North. We got diners and delicatessen, stuffing is stuffing, it ain't dressing. Catholic churches for confessing, that's what I like about the North. Cooperstown, Niagara Falls, the Garden, Carnegie Hall, the art on New York subway walls. That's what I miss about the North. Play football in 2 feet of snow, Lambeau Field in Timberlow. And if folks don't like you, you will know. That's what I like about the North. There's Harlem Jazz, Chicago Blues, Motown Soul, and Jersey Blues. Prince and the Revolution, that's what I like about the North. Siskel, Liebert, L Train, Chicago Hope, O'Hara Plains, the toast of Illinois, Champagne, that's what I like about the North. Iowa's Field of Dreams, soda fountains and egg creams, and the Braves ain't America's team, and that's what I like about the North. There's Cincinnati, three-way chili, corner doo-wop up in Philly, the Mick the Duke and say hey Willie, that's what I like about the North. How about the Indians in Ohio and the Vikings up in Minnesota, Mary Tyler Moore and Rhoda, that's what I like about the North. There's UNNYU,
UTB and LT2, NYPD Blue. That's what I like about the North. Brooklyn, Queens, and Manhattan, Islands, Ellis, Long, and Staten. Little bit of this, little bit of that, and that's what I like about the North. Knicks, Rangers, Giants, Yankees, Norton, Ralph, Alfalfa, Spanky. Hoboken was the home of Frankie. That's what I like about the North. How about devil dogs, ring dings? I can't get enough of them buffalo wings. Joey Bada Fuko, Bada Boom, Bada Bing. That's what I like about the North. The Gottis and the Corleones, hard salami and provolone. We don't eat Christmas dinner at Shoney's, and that's what I like about the North. We don't fix to do, we just do it. When it snows, we drive right through it. We smoke tobacco, we don't chew it. That's what I like about the North. And we drink Heineken and Beck's, not Budweiser long necks. We don't ask for separate checks, and that's what I like about the North. And we eat walnuts, not pralines. And my mama didn't have me at 17. And all my neighbors have different genes. That's what I like about the North. There's New York's Hayden Planetarium. We give folks rides. We don't carry them. We love our cousins, but we don't marry them. That's what There's the Hamptons in Hyannisport, Patrick Ewing and Michael Jordan, and NASCAR racing ain't no sport, and that's what I like about the North. A sack's a sack and a bag's a bag. We won the war, but we don't brag. We salute just one flag. That's what I like about the North. Hallelujah. We're not saying that the North is better. It's just cooler. Bring a sweater. Meet a Brooklyn chick and you'll never forget her. That's what I like about the North. So pack that U-Haul, y'all come see. You can bring the whole family, but don't tell no one you know me. That's what I like about the North. And that's what I like about the North.
And our iced tea does not come pre-sweetened.
Oh my goodness.
That is fantastic.
I can't believe we played that in Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia. Oh my Lord, I almost got killed many times.
Well, you live to tell a story.
Yeah.
Eddie, thanks so much for going on the show.
Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by June Goldfinger and Jeff Taylor, sponsors of Circle, Square, Triangle, a traveling exhibition on the architecture of Myron Goldfinger. And by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs. Okay, Tom, take us out.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 23,000 significant modernist houses, and access 4.5 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl, with guest research by Bobby Morris. Creative is her middle name, or it could be Cora. We have yet to figure that out. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I'll be back soon with another down-home Nashville edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.